Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. As she mentioned, my name is Jennifer Heisz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University. Just finished my teaching term. This is one of the lectures, part of the lecture I gave to my second year health psychology class. So consider yourself true university students. You're back in it. So today I'll be talking about brain health and aging, and I'm going to explore some of the benefits of physical activity on brain health as we age. So I want to start with some of the bad news, and we'll kind of get it out of the way. So as we get older, the truth is our mental abilities are going to gradually decline. And there's three mental abilities that are most affected. Our memory, so our ability to recognize people and remember their names. I struggle with that for sure. Our ability to process information quickly. So for example, if you're driving your car, being able to react to something changing in the environment. And your ability to focus your attention and ignore distractions so you can kind of focus on a task at hand. And so those three mental abilities seem to be really affected by the aging process. And in fact, what's really interesting is that these abilities start to gradually decline starting in our 30s. So I'm experiencing some decline already, sadly. But there's good news. Okay, so the bad news is out of the way. The good news is that we can control our rate of decline. And so specifically through a program of regular physical activity, we can reduce our risk of dementia, and we can promote our cognition and our mental health across the lifespan. So this is the good news. And we've learned a lot about the link between physical activity and cognition through work in animal models. And this has been really fascinating work. What they've demonstrated is that exercise actually makes the brain more plastic, more changeable. And specifically in animal models, the exercise helps grow new brain cells in a brain region called the hippocampus, which is important for memory. This is a really fascinating discovery in animal work. However, we don't really understand exactly what's going on in us humans, and that's really what we're most interested in, right? So the work that we're doing is trying to understand how is exercise changing the brain, how can it be used to support cognitive health across the lifespan, and in particular, as we're getting older. So today I'm going to present a potential mechanism, some research I've been working on, where exercise is helping to shift the way the brain is processing information. And I'll explore this in detail. Don't worry, no brain knowledge is necessary ahead of time. Okay. So here's the agenda of the talk. I want to give you a full overview, a full appreciation of this research. So I'll first give an overview of the link between cognition and aging and physical activity. Then I'll talk about how the brain is representing complex cognitive information. We'll look at how that representation changes with aging and with physical activity. And then finally, I'll give you some real practical tips for how you can incorporate physical activity into your daily life. Okay, let's begin by reviewing the benefits or the link between cognition and physical activity. And there are really two sources of information where we can draw this association. So the first is epidemiological or observational data, and this is data taken from the population, survey data collected from the population. Some of you might be involved in the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, and this is a type of epidemiological study. The second type of data that we get are called randomized control trials, or these are trials, experiments where we bring people into the lab, enroll them in an exercise program, and measure the effect it has on their brain. So there's these two pieces of evidence. So with respect to epidemiological study, or this observational data, we've learned a great deal that aging, and increasing in our age, and genetics increase our risk for developing dementia. But what's really fascinating is that physical activity is the greatest modifiable risk factor, i.e. something we can control and change, that reduces your risk of developing dementia. A study in my lab looked at the interaction between your genes and your physical activity behavior. And we looked at this, it was an epidemiological study with 1,600 individuals from Canada who were part of the Canadian Study of Health and Aging. And of our sample, 25% of them had a risk factor for dementia. For those of you interested, it's the apolipoprotein E4 allele. There's no test later, so don't worry. So 25% had this risk factor, but the majority, 75%, did not. And this is really the proportion that exists in our population. So most of us are not at a genetic risk. So in this study, we took all older adults, 65 years and older. All of them were dementia-free at the start of the study, and we followed up with them 5 years later. And here are the results. So I'm plotting the percentage of people with dementia, and here are individuals with that genetic risk. So of those individuals, 21% of them had developed dementia 5 years later. And there was no impact of physical activity for this group. The real interesting part was related to the people who do not have a genetic risk for dementia. And what we found was that people without a genetic risk who were physically active had a significantly reduced risk of developing dementia 5 years later compared to people who were inactive. And what was more is that those who were inactive had a similar risk level to people who were genetically predisposed. I think this is a really striking example, that physical activity or lifestyle can contribute to your dementia risk as much as your genetics. We can't change our genetics, we got what we got, but we can change our lifestyle. And I think this is a really powerful message. And what's especially exciting from a public health perspective is that most of us don't have the genetic risk. So for most of us, physical activity will really be beneficial at reducing our risk of dementia. Okay, so that's epidemiological evidence. Here is some randomized control trials. So remember, these are the trials where we'd recruit people from the Hamilton community, for example, bring them into our Physical Activity Center of Excellence, the PACE, and we'd enroll them in a new exercise program. And when it comes to these randomized control trials, generally what's found is that exercise benefits your focus, helps you to focus your attention better, and it helps to improve your memory. So these two things seem to be especially improve with a program of exercise. However, not all studies find positive results. And if you were to look in the literature, you would see a mix of results, in fact. And one of the hypotheses we asked was, does it have to do with the type of program that's being offered for seniors? And when we reviewed the literature, it was clear that most programs are having seniors work at a really low intensity. And our thinking was that, well, maybe this isn't enough of a stimulus to get the brain changing. So we tested this in my lab, and we got older adults, we recruited from the Hamilton community, older adults 65 and plus, who weren't in an exercise program, and we enrolled them in this 12-week intervention study. And we had older adults exercise at this high intensity. We got their heart rate up to 95% of their maximum heart rate. And this is rarely done in older adult studies, but it's been shown beneficial for cardiac rehab, actually. So we wanted to test it here in the brain health domain. We compared this group to a moderate intensity exercise group where their heart rate got up to about 75% of their max. And this is a much lower intensity, and it's typically what's done in the studies in the literature, this or lower. And the third group, they acted as a stretching control group, and this was really a placebo group, kind of a sham exercise group. They did chair yoga, what it was. So, you know, not intense. Some people felt improvements, actually, like checking their blind spot, for example. They thought that helped with that, but mostly placebo effect. So the important thing here was that most studies do the moderate intensity exercise, which may not be enough of a stimulus to get the brain changing, especially in a short amount of time. So when we think about these randomized control trials, they really only last a few months. And if we want to make changes in the brain in a few months, we might need a bigger stimulus. Okay, so what did we do? So we measured before and after the trial, we measured memory on this cognitive task. And this task measures memory function. So what a participant would see, they would be presented in the learning phase. They would see these items. They would come one at a time on the computer screen, and they'd be asked to study them. Then, during the test phase, they would have to make a discrimination about each item. So some of the items were new. They had never been seen before in this list. Some were old, which means they had been previously seen. So this one is the same. Or, and this is the tricky one, they're similar. So it's the same category, it's kind of the same item, but it's not exactly the same image. And the ability to distinguish these highly similar images in your mind is this high interference memory. And it's believed to depend on the hippocampus, that newborn cells in the hippocampus. So that's why we wanted to test this specific task. So as you can imagine, that's a very hard task. I'm not very good at it. Okay. So here are the results for that task on that similar judgment task. And I'm plotting here their performance accuracy for each of the groups, the high intensity, moderate intensity, and control group. And this dotted line represents baseline performance, so performance before any exercise happened. And there were no group differences at that time. Everyone was about the same. And here's what happened after the exercise. We see a dramatic increase in memory performance for the high intensity exercise group. And they were significantly better at performing at this task compared to now the moderate intensity group and the control group. Interestingly, as we predicted, for the moderate intensity, it was no different than the control. And so this may help to explain why some studies that bring seniors into the lab and test them, they may not get the positive benefits of exercise on cognition in this short amount of time. Now that said, when we think about the epidemiological studies, remember, these often are related to walking behavior, which is of a moderate to low intensity, but these individuals are doing this across their lifespan. And I think that that's critical, that you can get changes in brain plasticity with low to moderate intensity brisk walking, for example, but you have to be doing it continuously for a long period of time. If you want to get quick changes fast, you need to rely on a higher stimulus, like high intensity exercise. So overall, when we think about the link between cognition and physical activity, I think there's really promising evidence that there is a positive link, that physical activity both reduces your risk of developing dementia, and it also can promote cognition in older adults. So now let's think about how is this working? How could exercise, moving the body, actually be changing the brain? And this is something this is my main interest and passion. So let's first think, this is a neuroscience primer. Let's think about how the brain is representing cognition. So when I think about cognitive processes, just think about in your mind what's going on. You're probably thinking about, oh, what am I doing later? What's this neuroscience stuff? I don't know. I haven't been in school for, your mind has this constant chatter. It's this dynamic process. And to illustrate what I mean by this dynamic process, consider what comes to mind when you see this face. You ready? You may recognize that it's Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister of Canada, who's following in the footsteps of his father. You may know that he's married and has 3 children. You may also be thinking of how could our Prime Minister have once been a boxer? But I mean, that's something interesting. And for me, I met his mom, so whenever I see a picture of him, I think of that time his mom spoke here at McMaster. Some of you may have been at that lecture. It was really fantastic. Anyway, the point is, when you see this face, it's not just a face, but a cue that unlocks this dynamic information that's associated with it. So then how do these dynamics play out in the brain? Well, the brain, we can represent it as a network. And I've done that here in the orange. So we can think of the brain as a network where the dots represent different brain regions, and the lines between those dots represent connections between those brain regions. And so when we see a familiar face like Justin Trudeau, it activates part of the associative network, which in turn elicits this temporal dynamic response that we can measure as the brain's response on the scalp using neuroimaging techniques. When the activation spreads across that network, information about that person comes to mind. All the things we know about that person start to emerge in our consciousness. And as that information comes online, the corresponding brain signal becomes more and more complex, so that the complexity of that signal is really representing the amount of information you have that's associated with that particular person, that particular face. Okay, so when we think about 2 hypothetical brain networks, the top one is what we would call more complex. And if you were to ping it at any one point and activation would flow across it, there's many different degrees of freedom for which the activation could flow across the top network, relative to the bottom one, which is much simpler. And so if we were to ping this one, it would generate a pretty simple sinusoid wave. It has very few degrees of freedom for which activation can spread. And so when we do that and measure the actual brain signal, the brain's response, we can see that for the complex brain network, we have a more complex brain signal compared to the simple network with the simple signal. And what my research has shown is that familiar faces, like our Prime Minister, he's associated with more rich, complex brain signals than an unfamiliar face. Some of you might know him, but I don't. So for me, this guy has a very simple, less complex brain signal than Prime Minister Trudeau. Okay. Oh, so one thing. So let's bring this back to the main point. Okay. What's happening with aging and what's physical activity doing here? So when we think about aging, remember the bad news. Our cognitive ability declines with aging. So we might expect there's a loss in brain signal complexity. And one way that exercise may help to promote cognition in aging is by helping to sustain the complexity as we get older. Everybody with me? Good. Okay. So brain signal complexity is a way that we're representing cognitive information. The more complex, the more information we have associated with that cue. So now let's think about how the brain signal complexity changes with aging and with exercise. So I'm going to first orient you to this graph because there's going to be a few shown, and I want you to really understand what I'm showing. So on the y-axis here, I have entropy, and entropy you can think of as the complexity measure. Okay, so going from low complexity to high complexity. So higher values mean more complexity. Okay? And then on the bottom, I have time scale, going from fine time scales to coarse time scales. And the fine time scales represent communication, information processing between brain regions that are close together. Okay, so all the brain regions are communicating together, and this is capturing the information that's being shared between brain regions that are close in proximity. Whereas the coarse or distributed information is communication between brain regions that are further apart. Okay? And so when we measure the complexity pattern in a young adult brain, we see this type of pattern where there's pretty low complexity at the fine time scale. So that local information, there's not a ton of that going on. It rapidly increases to about at time scale 5 and then stays high throughout the coarse time scales. So what does this mean? Well, it suggests that young adults are really biasing towards the long-range communication. And if you think about this, this would be an efficient way to combine different sensory information to give you a really rich representation of the world. So this would be advantageous. Okay, so the young brain, it's showing this pattern where complexity, the information processing, is biasing sort of long-range communication. Okay. So when we think about changes across the lifespan in brain complexity, what would we expect? Well, if you think about what happens during child development, you know, if you have grandchildren, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I'm seeing tremendous changes in her cognitive ability. And as they grow up to adulthood, their cognitive ability, their mental capacity become more sophisticated. They can do more things that they weren't able to do before. And so, if we think about this, it might make sense that the brain signal complexity would also increase as their cognitive ability becomes more complex. And that's what we find. So this is that same graph that I walked you through before, and I'm plotting the black is 8 to 9-year-olds, the green is 10-year-olds, the blue is 12-year-olds, the pink is 14-year-olds, and then the light blue is adults. And what you see is there's this progressive increase in complexity as young children are becoming adults. And this makes sense with what we know about the developing brain. Infants, their brain is highly redundant. It's very simple, and through pruning and specialization of the synapse, these connections become much more complex and specialized and can support more efficient and more complex cognitive processing. Okay, so what do you think is happening at the other end of the lifespan? Any guesses? Well, when we think about the aging brain, so we compare it to a young, there are a lot of changes that are taking place. A few of the changes include there's some shrinking of regions, so the volume of the brain tends to shrink, and the connections between those brain regions start to erode. And so what the older brain, this architecture that we're now working with, it may not be able to support the same type of processing that was effective when we were young. So I like to think of an analogy here. I'm a tennis fan, and Andre Agassi, it was amazing. He played well into his 40s and was competitive, but he changed his game. So when he was young, he could rely on power, and that let him be competitive. But as he got older, his power was no longer competitive, so he had to switch the way he played. And he had to focus more on technique, drops, shots, slices. And this helped him to stay competitive. And so a similar phenomenon happens in the brain, believe it or not. Not slices, but something different. So the brain is able to either adapt or maintain. And this, we'll look at some fMRI data. So just to orient you, we can look at the middle picture here. This is a top-down view of the brain. The front is at the top and the back is at the bottom. And the circle is representing the frontal cortex. And what I want you to notice is that for the older adults here, they have much more activation, more light, green light in this space than the younger adults. It's suggesting they're doing something different. And what's more interesting is when we split older adults into those who are doing really well and those who are doing poorly on this cognitive task. And we see that when we compare to young adults, the low-performing older adults are doing the same thing. Their brain patterns look the same as the young adults. Whereas the brain pattern for the high-performing older adults, the ones who did well on this task, it looks different. They're recruiting a different brain region for processing. Okay. So a similar phenomenon happens when we look at brain signal complexity. So here's a picture of the older adult who's low performing. So they would be having difficulty with their cognitive ability, compared to a high-performing older adult. And what you can notice is there's a dramatic shift in this curve when we look at low-performing adults versus high-performing adults. And you can see there's a drop for the high performers. They're doing less of that long-range communication. You can see it's dropped down, but they're doing more of the local information processing. So it suggests there's this shift in the way the brain is processing information. Instead of biasing towards long-range distributed information processing, it's really focusing on local information processing. Okay, so how does physical activity play? What role does it play in these brain dynamics and cognition? So we looked at this with an observational study. So we surveyed older adults this was done in Toronto, the Toronto community, and we split them into those who were highly physically active and those who reported being low physically active. And so we have the two groups. The high active older adults are clearly more active than the low active. And we used a questionnaire that also looked at their socio-cognitive activity. This would include things like volunteering, engaging in community work, attending educational lectures, which are all good for your brain health too. But for this group, they didn't differ. So that we thought that was a good control, that they were doing similar levels of socio-cognitive, but really they were differing on these physical activity measures. So we can dig a bit deeper into what those adults were doing. And we did this using we broke it down into whether they were walking, doing outdoor sport, resistance training, aerobics, and stretching. And they reported how frequently they did those, going from never all the way to daily. And what was interesting here is that both groups reported walking a lot. Okay, they reported walking about 3 times per week. Neither did much outdoor activity or sport, but the groups really differed in their structured exercise. So the high active older adults reported engaging in more resistance training, aerobics, and stretching. So this more structured exercise. We measured their cognitive ability using a working memory task, which involves both focusing your attention and remembering items. So it combines the two. And we found that the high active older adults perform better at this than the low active older adults. And this is consistent with what we talked about before. What was interesting though is that look how good our high active are doing compared to our young. Pretty close. You know, not statistically significant. So it suggests that the older adults, even though they're older, they're able to still perform as well as young adults, especially in this high active group. Okay, so now let's look at the brain complexity. How is this high active versus low active older adults? What's going on with their brain? And what we see, again, similar to what we saw before, is there's this increase in the local information processing. So high active older adults have this heightened local information processing, and if you remember before, that was associated with better cognitive ability overall. So how does this all come together? Well, we think about younger brains, they're intact, fortified structures, and they can rely on these long-range distributed information processing. As we get older, things sort of change, let's say, and relying on that long-range communication, if the wires are starting to get frayed, may not be the best way to process information anymore, and there may be information loss, communication breakdown. And so this could lead to cognitive impairment. But older adults, this is really good news, there's ability to functionally adapt the way the brain processes information to favor these more local information processing, leading to better cognitive health. And it seems like exercise may be a way to increase that chance that your brain is able to functionally adapt. So the exercise is able to increase the plasticity in your brain, helping you to maintain your cognitive ability as you get older. Okay, so we've looked at a lot so far, and now I want to give you some practical tips on how to make physical activity a permanent lifestyle change. Everyone knows it's good for you, right? Now you know it's really good for your brain, for cognition. But there's one very important thing with exercise, and that is you actually have to do it. And that's the hardest part, right? So the Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines recommend that you do 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise per week. That seems like a lot. And that's sort of something, if you're not active right now, something you want to build up towards. Some is better than none. But what's most important is that you're doing it regularly, 3 or 4 times a week, going for a brisk walk. However, making a commitment like that and sticking with it over the long term, especially the winter, can be really challenging. And so what can we do? So I'm going to talk about this one study. My colleague did this study where she recruited women who were not currently active and gave them a new fitness goal of trying to make 10,000 steps per day. And the women were either given a plan, which meant they were given a calendar and they were taught about to write down in the calendar what they were doing, where they were going to exercise, when they were going to exercise, and who they were going to exercise with. So just plan it out ahead of time in the calendar what you're going to do. The no plan group had the same fitness goal, but they didn't get the calendar, they weren't shown how to plan. And here are the results. you can see the plan group did much better at sticking with the program over the long term. So that like 6 weeks, 7 weeks, when most of us tend to fall off, the plan group, just having this activity planned in your schedule, kept them with the program, kept them able to reach their fitness goal. And this is actually something I do. This is a snapshot of my calendar. The first year I was a professor at McMaster, and I don't know why I did this, but I was training for my first marathon at the time. Thinking back now, it seemed rather crazy. I also had, my daughter at the time was 2, so this was even more crazy. So here's the physical activity appointments, and I keep these to the same high regard as I keep my work-related appointments. So scheduling them in, talking about what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. This takes the thinking out of the moment. You know, a lot of us say, oh, we don't have time to exercise. But if it's planned and it's in there, you can't book over it. So it really can help you stick with the goal. And that year, even though I was really busy, I was able to successfully complete the marathon. I was kind of slow, but I mean, whatever. And reach my fitness goal. Okay, so to summarize, we've looked at and learned about how that there's a link between cognition and physical activity, that brain signal complexity can support cognition. This is that representation. And that representation changes with aging and with physical exercise. And I've given you one tip to help make a permanent lifestyle change. So of course, I don't do this work all by myself. This is my team. I'd like to thank them, thank our funding agencies, and thank you for your attention. Thanks very much.